What's up, guys? This is TheKephas. In this video, I am going to showcase some new macros that I have created for World of Warcraft using a mod called GNOME Sequencer Enhanced. This mod allows you to create extremely powerful macros that can perform most, if not all, of your rotation with a single button. This can be extremely useful for individuals like myself who has a disability, or for people who just want to be lazy. So keep in mind that these macros are created primarily for those who are playing the game at a more casual level, but feel free to use them and alter them as you see fit. If you have further questions about the mod or my macros, I recommend checking out my FAQ video, and if you'd like to learn more about how to play the class in question, you might want to check out my crash course. It can help get you started, and I will provide links to all of these things in the description below. So today we're going to take a look at the macro that I've created for Unholy Death Knights. Now this one I'm really happy about because in the past I've always had to use two macros, one for building festering wounds and one for gross but bursting festering wounds. I hate Unholy Death Knights because of how disgusting they are, but they're really fun to play, so it's fine. But I've been able to merge both of those things into one macro with the use of modifiers, also finally including Outbreak. We will get into all that, but in the past it's always been very difficult to macro Unholy with the way they are currently implemented with the festering wounds mechanics and all that, because it's just you can't macro those together and have a macro trying to use those abilities at the same time. But with the use of modifiers, you actually can. So let's go ahead and get right into it. This macro should cover pretty much everything. So we type /GS to open up GNOME Sequencer. We scroll down past all of my experimental macros, and the one that you will be importing will be called Kef Unholy, and it is a macro for single target and AoE. So we right click it, and then we check it out. And this is pretty much everything that it is going to do. If you do not have a pet summoned, this macro will raise dead, summon your ghoul, and then it will also command your ghoul to attack your target. Now, then we move right on into modifiers. If you hold down Control, the macro will use Outbreak. And if you hold down Alt, the macro will use Apocalypse. Now, I tried to put Apocalypse just outright in the macro so that you wouldn't have to manage it with a modifier. But the thing is, you want to have 4 festering wounds to get the most out of Apocalypse. And if I put it in the macro outright without using a modifier, then it's simply going to use Apocalypse whenever it can. So whether you have 1 wound or 4, it's going to use it. So this gives you more control. That way, when you know that you've got 4 wounds, at least 4, you can hold down Alt, keep using your macro, and you will use Apocalypse, and you'll get the most out of it. You'll get more ghouls, and that's exactly what you want. So it's just easier to put it in with a modifier. Now, that's what it will do so far. We look over at pre-macro, and of course, if you've seen any of my macros, you know what's coming. This is where your essences are put. This is where I put essences now. So in this case, I'm using Concentrated Flame. And if you use a different essence, if you're not sure what I'm talking about, it's the 8.2 essences. If you're not in current content, this doesn't matter. But if you're switching out your essences, like say to Memory of Lucid Dreams, then you'd want to change Concentrated Flame to Memory of Lucid Dreams here in the macro. So make sure you come and edit that as you see fit. If you're switching out your essences, make sure that you remember to come and change it here if you want the macro to manage it. Now, we move on down to the main macro, and this is pretty self-explanatory. It covers a lot of talents, which is very handy, and all in one macro. So if you are using Summon Gargoyle, the macro will use it on cooldown. And then we move into Dark Transformation. This is high priority, so it's at the top of the list. It's going to use that on cooldown. And then if you have Unholy Blight, of course, it's going to use it. Same with, so next up is Death and Decay. Now, Death and Decay is one of those abilities, for the most part, you want to use it in AoE situations, but I've gone ahead and included it here. If you don't want the macro to manage it, and use it all the time, then you are free to remove it. But basically, what I've done is I've made it so that you cast it at your feet. That's what the @player line is. If I don't put @player in, then the macro will not be able to manage Death and Decay because it's one of those target location abilities, and you can't use that. The macro can't use that without me putting a command in like @player. The other option would be @cursor, which means that it would use it wherever your cursor is. And since you're spamming a macro, you don't really want that because you can't guarantee that your cursor is going to be in the spot that it needs to be in whenever the macro decides to use death and decay. So I do it @player. You are a melee class, so for the most part, you should be like right up to where all of your targets are, so it should for the most part work out just fine just casting it at your feet. But if you don't like that, feel free to remove death and decay from the macro. Now we get into the next line, and this is a very important line. So another modifier is being used. If you hold down shift, the macro will use Scourge Strike, which means it will consume your festering wounds. If you don't hold down shift, then the macro is going to use Festering Strike, which means that it will build festering wounds. And that's how I've managed to combine both of these into one macro. So with one macro, you're able to manage Outbreak, Festering Strike, and Scourge Strike all in one macro just by holding down a modifier, and even with Apocalypse. So it's really easy. Once you get kind of the used to, holding down the modifier, you can just keep spamming the macro, hit the modifier when you want to use one of those 3 abilities, and yeah, it's pretty straightforward. So keep in mind that's how it's going to work. And the good thing is with this Scourge Strike, Festering Strike, when you hold down shift, it means the macro will use Scourge Strike and it will no longer try to use Festering Strike. And that's what's important about it, because if I just put those abilities in separate lines, then the macro is always going to try to use both of them at all times, and that's not going to guarantee that it's going to be working as intended. So that's kind of the idea there. That way you have more control over which one of those abilities you want to use. So then we move into Soul Reaper. The macro is simply going to use it on cooldown when it can. Then we move into Death Coil. Now this is where it's a little bit more complicated, but I'll try to explain it. So it's going to spend your runic power on Death Coil if you haven't chosen Epidemic as a talent. So because Epidemic also uses runic power. So if you aren't choosing Epidemic, you've chosen Talent 6-1 or Talent 6-2, then it's going to use Death Coil. If you choose Talent 6-3, which is Epidemic, then your runic power will be spent on Epidemic. It's as simple as that. So that's basically how the macro is going to work with that. It's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy, but I wanted to make sure that I explained it. Now, in the last line, of course, if you've chosen Unholy Frenzy, which is more of a cooldown long-term talent, then it will try to use it as much as possible whenever it's off cooldown. And I've also included Anti-Magic Shell in the macro. This is sort of a defensive cooldown, but it also generates runic power, so I went ahead and added it in. If you don't like any of these, this goes without saying, if you don't like any of these abilities, if you want more control over Anti-Magic Shell, feel free to remove it from the macro and use it on a separate button. But overall, that is everything you need to know about this macro. Let's go ahead and take a look at talents. It's pretty self-explanatory, but there are a couple to take note of. So the first one, of course, is Clawing Shadows. This obviously is included in the macro because it replaces Scourge Strike, and since the macro uses Scourge Strike, then it will also use Clawing Shadows. And that also goes for Defile. Since the macro uses Death and Decay, it will also use Defile. Pretty much everything else is covered in the macro, or it's a passive, or it's like, one of those utility abilities, and we don't cover those in the macro. But pretty much the macro will manage all of the usable abilities that aren't utility abilities without you having to worry about anything. Just hold down a modifier for 3 specific abilities, and the macro will work just fine. And that's basically everything you need to know about these macros and how they work. Remember, these macros work best when they are spammed, so either press the button as fast as you can or use a rapid fire button, which is fair game as long as you're the one pressing the button. As powerful as these macros are, they are far from perfect. So if you want to play the game at a high level and get the most out of your class, I highly recommend that you play the game without these macros. But if you'd like to get started with Gnome Sequencer Enhanced, you can do so by downloading and installing the mod. A link can be found in the description below. Along with it, you will find paste bin links for any macros featured in this video. If you'd like to use them, simply click the link and you'll be taken to a raw paste bin of the macro. Select the entire macro, copy, log into the appropriate class, type /GS to open the Gnome Sequencer screen, click on Import, paste the macro into the available space, make sure that Automatically Create Macro Icon is checked, and click Import. You can now drag the icon to your action bar and the macro is ready to be used. If you followed all the steps correctly, the macro should be working fine. If something isn't working, Start over and make sure that you follow all the steps correctly. If you are having further issues, I recommend that you check out the mod page or contact the mod's author for more information. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button, and feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. Don't forget, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook and Twitter, and if you'd like, you can support this channel on Patreon. Links to all of this can be found in the description below. This is TheKephas. Until next time.